Can $100 and a stubborn little spark of hope really pull two people out of poverty? That question kept echoing in my mind the night I met Daniel and Lila. They weren't always broken like this. They weren't lazy. They weren't careless. They were just tired. Tired in a way that seeps into your bones and whispers that nothing will ever change. Daniel worked 2 jobs, one at a warehouse loading trucks before sunrise, another washing dishes until midnight. Lila stitched clothes from home, her fingers raw from cheap fabric and cheaper thread. They lived in a tiny basement apartment where the ceiling leaked when it rained and the heater coughed more than it warmed. But what hurt the most wasn't the cold. It was the silence between them. Bills stacked on the kitchen counter like accusations. Rent overdue. Electricity threatening to be cut off. Groceries stretched so thin that dinner sometimes meant toast and water. They laughed less. They spoke less. Love didn't disappear. It just hid behind exhaustion. Some nights, Lila would stare at the cracked wall and whisper, "Is this all our life will ever be?" And Daniel, staring at his calloused hands, had no answer. They stopped visiting friends because they couldn't afford bus fare. They avoided family because they were ashamed. Every knock on the door made their hearts race. Was it the landlord? Another warning notice? Hope didn't leave all at once. It faded slowly. Like a light bulb losing power. And then one evening, something happened. Something so small it almost seemed meaningless. But what if I told you that everything began to change because of a single decision? And a single $100 bill. And what happened next? Neither of them saw coming. The night everything began to shift didn't feel magical. It felt cold. Daniel came home soaked from unexpected rain, his shoes squishing against the cracked linoleum floor. Lila was sitting at the tiny table under the flickering kitchen bulb, staring at an envelope she hadn't opened yet. She didn't need to. They both knew what it was. Another bill. Another reminder that they were falling behind. Daniel tried to joke. Maybe it's a thank you card for being such loyal customers. Lila didn't laugh. She looked up at him, her eyes glossy but determined not to spill. They're giving us 7 days. 7 days. 7 days before the electricity would be cut. 7 days before the apartment would become darker than it already felt. Daniel sank into the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, hands gripping his hair. He had done everything right. Worked harder. Slept less. Skipped meals. And still, it wasn't enough. "I'm failing you," he whispered. Lila reached across the table and held his hands. "No. We're drowning." "That's not the same as failing. But drowning feels a lot like it." The next morning, Daniel picked up an extra shift. Lila stayed up all night finishing an urgent sewing order that paid barely enough for groceries. They were fighting exhaustion, fighting fear, fighting the quiet voice that kept saying, "Give up." And then, on their way home 2 days later, something unusual caught Lila's eye. A small crowd had gathered in the local park. A banner hung between 2 trees, Community Outreach Day, free meals and financial guidance. Daniel almost kept walking. "We don't need charity," he muttered, pride tightening his jaw. Lila hesitated. Pride had kept them hungry before. "Maybe," she said softly, "we just need help." That one sentence hung between them heavier than any bill. They stood there on the sidewalk, rain clouds forming again above them, unsure which direction would cost them more, their pride or their future. And the choice they made in the next few seconds would lead them to something neither of them expected. Something that would test their faith in strangers. And in themselves. Daniel hated the way his feet felt heavy as they stepped into the park. He told himself they were just there for information. Just to look. Just to see. But deep down, he knew this was something bigger. This was surrendering the illusion that they could fix everything alone. The park smelled like warm soup and fresh bread. Volunteers moved between folding tables with gentle smiles, offering plates of food without questions, without judgment. Children ran across the grass, laughing as if life had never been hard. Lila's stomach growled before her pride could silence it. A young volunteer handed them 2 bowls of stew and said, "We're glad you came. Not do you need help? Not what happened to you? Just, we're glad you came." Daniel felt something in his chest shift. They sat on a bench, eating slowly. The food was simple, but it tasted like relief. Like someone, somewhere, cared whether they went to bed hungry. After they finished, Lila noticed a small table set up beneath an oak tree. A handwritten sign read, "Financial Coaching, Free Sessions." Behind the table sat an older woman with silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She wasn't calling people over. She wasn't pushing pamphlets. She was just listening, to a man explaining his debts, to a mother describing medical bills. Listening like their stories mattered. Lila squeezed Daniel's hand. "Let's just ask," she whispered. Daniel hesitated again. Every instinct told him to turn away. But exhaustion has a way of softening pride. They approached. The woman looked up and smiled, not the kind of smile you give out of politeness, but the kind that reaches your eyes. "I'm Margaret," she said warmly. "Tell me what's been weighing on you." And just like that, the walls Daniel had built for months began to crack. He told her about the overdue bills. The double shifts. The leaking ceiling. The fear of losing everything. Margaret didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. She nodded gently and asked careful questions, like she was untangling a knot thread by thread. When they finished, Daniel felt strangely lighter. But also exposed. Margaret leaned back and said, "You're not irresponsible. You're overwhelmed." "That's different." Those words hit harder than any insult ever could. And then she reached into her bag. What she pulled out next would change the direction of their lives. In a way neither of them were prepared for. Margaret didn't pull out a miracle. She pulled out a simple white envelope. It looked ordinary. Thin. Unremarkable. The kind of envelope that usually brings bad news, not hope. She placed it gently on the table between them. "There's $100 in here," she said softly. "No paperwork. No conditions. It's from our emergency kindness fund. It's not much. But sometimes a small start is all people need." Daniel blinked. $100. For a moment, it felt insulting. How could something so small fix something so big? Their problems were mountains. This was a pebble. But then Margaret continued. "I don't believe this money will save you," she said. "I believe what you do with it might." Lila's fingers trembled as she picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than it should have. Daniel swallowed hard. "Why would you give this to us?" Margaret smiled again, softer this time. "Because someone once gave me the same chance." Silence wrapped around them. The park noises faded into the background. $100 couldn't erase their debt. It couldn't fix the ceiling. It couldn't guarantee tomorrow. But it could keep the lights on for another week. It could buy groceries without calculating every single coin. It could buy time. And sometimes, time is everything. Margaret didn't stop there. She slid a small card across the table. "There's a job skills workshop this Thursday. Free certification programs. I think you'd qualify. And here's a list of local food banks, rental assistance programs, and a credit counselor I trust." This wasn't just money. It was direction. As Daniel stood up, he felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not relief. Not yet. Possibility. They walked home quietly, the envelope tucked safely inside Lila's coat pocket. The rain had stopped. The sky wasn't clear, but it wasn't storming either. For the first time in months, Daniel didn't feel completely trapped. But here's the truth. Money can offer hope. What you choose to do next determines everything. And what Daniel decided that night would either waste that $100 or multiply it into something neither of them could have imagined. That night, the envelope sat on the kitchen table between them. $100. Daniel kept staring at it like it might disappear if he blinked too long. Lila finally broke the silence. "We could pay part of the electricity bill." Daniel nodded slowly. "Or buy groceries so we don't keep skipping meals." They both knew the truth, it wasn't enough to solve everything. So whatever they chose had to matter. After a long pause, Daniel leaned back and exhaled deeply. "What if we don't just survive with it? What if we try to move forward with it?" Lila looked at him carefully. She had heard that tone before, the one where hope tries to sneak back in. "The workshop," he continued. "If I get certified, I could apply for better warehouse positions. Supervisor roles. They pay almost double. But we need money now," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed. "And if we only use this to survive one more week. We'll be right back here next month." Silence. Then Lila did something unexpected. She tore the electricity bill in half. Daniel stared at her in shock. "We'll talk to them," she said firmly. "Ask for an extension. I'm tired of being afraid to ask." Her voice wasn't shaking anymore. They decided to divide the money carefully. $40 for basic groceries, rice, beans, eggs, bread. $20 for bus fare to attend the workshop. The rest. Saved. Saved. They hadn't used that word in months. The next morning, Daniel stood outside the training center, palms sweating. He felt out of place in his worn-out shoes and faded jacket. Around him were men and women who looked just as nervous. Inside, instructors spoke about logistics management, forklift certifications, scheduling software. Skills that sounded simple, but powerful. Daniel listened like his life depended on it. Because maybe it did. Meanwhile, Lila called the electricity company. Her voice trembled at first, but she didn't hang up. She explained everything. The hardship. The effort. The workshop. There was a long pause on the line. Then the representative sighed softly and said, "We can give you 2 more weeks." 2 more weeks. Lila covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks. For the first time, they weren't just reacting to crisis. They were planning. But hope can be fragile. And just when it seemed like things were steadying, something unexpected threatened to knock them down again. 3 days into the workshop, Daniel's phone buzzed during a break. He almost ignored it. Unknown number. Probably another reminder. Another demand. Another weight added to his shoulders. But something told him to answer. "Hello." The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. It was his warehouse manager. "Daniel, I'm sorry to tell you this, but we're cutting shifts. Corporate decision. Your evening hours are suspended until further notice." The words hit like ice water. Suspended. Until further notice. Daniel's throat tightened. That second job was the thin thread holding their rent together. Without it, even the 2-week extension wouldn't matter. He thanked his manager quietly and ended the call. For a moment, he just stood there in the hallway, staring at the dull gray wall. Around him, people laughed softly, discussing certifications and job opportunities. He felt like the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. When he got home that night, Lila could see it in his eyes before he spoke. "What happened?" He sat down slowly. "They cut my hours." The room went silent. Not dramatic silence. Not shouting. Not anger. Just the heavy, crushing quiet of fear returning. Lila's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "We were just starting to breathe." Daniel nodded. "I know." For a few seconds, despair tried to crawl back in. That familiar voice whispered, "See? It doesn't matter. Nothing changes." But then Daniel surprised himself. "I'm not quitting the workshop." Lila looked up sharply. "They cut my hours because I'm replaceable there," he continued. "I don't want to be replaceable anymore." His voice wasn't loud. But it was steady. The next day, he stayed late at the training center, asking questions, volunteering for extra practice. The instructor noticed. A middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor. "You're serious about this?" the instructor said. Daniel nodded. "I have to be." Meanwhile, Lila picked up extra sewing orders and even posted online offering simple clothing repairs at discounted prices. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. But they refused to let the setback define them. And then, at the end of the week, as Daniel prepared to take his certification test, someone called his name from across the training floor. And the offer that followed would change everything. "Daniel?" He turned around. It was the instructor. Mr. Alvarez didn't smile often, but today there was something different in his expression. He held a clipboard in one hand and gestured for Daniel to step aside. Daniel's heart pounded. Had he failed? Had he done something wrong? "I've been watching you this week," Mr. Alvarez began. Daniel braced himself. "You show up early. You stay late. You help others without being asked." Daniel swallowed. I need this." Mr. Alvarez studied him carefully. "There's a logistics company expanding across town. They called this morning looking for certified trainees. Entry-level supervisor track. Full-time. Benefits." Daniel blinked. Benefits? He hadn't heard that word connected to his name in years. "They need someone dependable," Mr. Alvarez continued. "I recommended you." For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. "You recommended me?" His voice cracked slightly. "I don't recommend people lightly." Daniel felt heat rush to his eyes. He quickly looked down, embarrassed by the sudden wave of emotion. He thought of Lila. The torn electricity bill. The envelope. The nights they went to bed hungry pretending they weren't. "When do they want to interview?" he asked quietly. "Tomorrow morning." Tomorrow. He walked home in a daze, the city noise fading into the background. When he opened the apartment door, Lila looked up from her sewing machine. "Well?" she asked softly. He didn't speak at first. He just walked toward her and pulled her into his arms. "I have an interview," he whispered into her hair. She froze. Then she pulled back, searching his face for doubt. "Full-time," he said. "Supervisor track." Her hands flew to her mouth. For a second, neither of them moved. Then laughter burst out of her, unexpected, shaky, almost disbelieving. "Daniel. That's real? It's real." They both sat down slowly, as if afraid standing might wake them from a dream. That night, they didn't sleep much. Not from worry. From hope. But interviews don't guarantee jobs. And tomorrow morning would test more than Daniel's skills. It would test whether this fragile new future was strong enough to finally begin. The morning of the interview felt unreal. Daniel stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, adjusting the only button-up shirt he owned. It wasn't perfect. The collar was slightly worn, and one sleeve button didn't quite match the other. But it was clean. Pressed. Ready. Lila stood behind him, gently smoothing the fabric over his shoulders. "You look like someone who belongs in that office," she whispered. Daniel gave a nervous half-smile. "I've never belonged in an office. Maybe you just haven't been invited yet." That stayed with him. The bus ride across town felt longer than usual. Each stop tightened the knot in his stomach. When he finally stood in front of the logistics company building, it seemed enormous: glass walls, polished floors, people walking in with confidence. For a second, doubt crept in. He doesn't belong here. But then he remembered the envelope. He remembered Margaret's words, "It's not the money. It's what you do with it." And he walked inside. The interview panel asked about leadership, conflict resolution, time management. Daniel didn't use fancy language. He didn't have corporate buzzwords memorized. He spoke about waking up at 4 a.m. and never being late. He spoke about helping coworkers finish shifts even when he was exhausted. He spoke about knowing what it feels like when every dollar matters. At one point, one of the interviewers leaned forward and asked, "Why should we choose you?" Daniel paused. "Because I need this. Because I'm desperate. Because I'm tired of struggling." Those were the honest answers. But instead, he said, "Because I won't treat this like a job. I'll treat it like a second chance." Silence filled the room. The panel nodded slowly. "We'll call you," they said. Those two words felt both hopeful and terrifying. When Daniel stepped back outside, the sky was clear for the first time in days. He called Lila immediately. "How did it go?" she asked, barely breathing. "I gave them everything I had. And now?" All they could do was wait. But sometimes, the waiting changes you more than the answer ever could. And the phone call that came that evening would either break their hearts or rebuild their entire lives. The phone rang at 6:47 p.m. Daniel and Lila were sitting on the floor, eating rice and eggs from the same plate to avoid washing extra dishes. They both froze when his phone lit up. Unknown number. The air in the room shifted. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he answered. "Hello." There was a brief pause. "Hi, Daniel. This is Karen from Horizon Logistics." His heartbeat thundered so loudly he could barely hear the rest. "We were impressed with your interview. We'd like to offer you the supervisor trainee position. Full-time. Starting Monday." The world stopped. Daniel blinked. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" Lila's eyes widened, searching his face for clues. "We're offering you the job," the voice repeated warmly. "Benefits begin after 90 days. There's growth potential if performance goals are met." Daniel couldn't speak for a moment. His throat closed, emotions crashing into each other all at once. "Yes," he finally managed. "Yes, I accept." When he hung up, he just stared at the phone. Lila whispered, "Daniel?" He looked at her. And he nodded. That was all it took. Lila burst into tears, real tears, the kind that had been held back for months. She covered her face, laughing and crying at the same time. Daniel dropped to his knees beside her, pulling her into his chest. "We did it," she kept repeating. "We did it." But it wasn't just about the job. It was about dignity returning. It was about breathing without fear. It was about realizing they weren't trapped forever. That night, they didn't talk about bills. They talked about paint colors for a better apartment someday. They talked about replacing the leaking ceiling. They talked about maybe, just maybe, starting a small tailoring business for Lila in the future. The room hadn't changed. The furniture was still worn. The walls were still cracked. But something inside them was different. Hope wasn't fragile anymore. It was growing. And yet, what happened months later would prove that the $100 had done more than help them survive. It had set something in motion they never expected. 3 months later, Daniel stood in the same park where everything had begun. But this time, he wasn't standing there with empty pockets and tired eyes. He was standing there with purpose. The supervisor-trainee position had turned into something steady. His performance reviews were strong. His paycheck, larger than any he had ever held, no longer disappeared the moment it arrived. They had caught up on rent, paid off overdue bills, even started a small savings account. Savings. The word still felt unreal. Lila's sewing work had grown too. With Daniel's encouragement, she began offering custom alterations through social media. What started as a few repair requests turned into regular clients. She smiled more now. Laughed more. The silence between them had been replaced with plans. And now, they were back at Community Outreach Day. Margaret was there, sitting beneath the same oak tree. When she looked up and saw them, her eyes widened. Daniel? Lila? They walked toward her, hands intertwined. We wanted to say thank you, Lila said softly. Margaret smiled. You don't owe me anything. Daniel gently placed an envelope on her table. I think we do. She looked confused. What's this? $100, Daniel said. For someone else. Margaret's expression shifted. Not surprise. Not pride. Understanding. You didn't need to do this, she whispered. Daniel nodded. I know. That's the point. He glanced around at the people sitting on benches, the families holding paper plates of food, the quiet desperation he once wore like a shadow. I thought that money saved us, he continued. But it wasn't the money. It was someone believing we could stand back up. Lila squeezed his hand. You gave us more than help. You gave us time to choose differently. Margaret's eyes shimmered as she accepted the envelope. As they walked away, Daniel felt something stronger than relief. Gratitude. $100 hadn't erased their poverty overnight. It gave them a starting line. It gave them courage. And sometimes, that's all it takes. So tell me, if someone handed you a small chance, would you use it to survive? Or would you use it to transform your life forever?